Okay, so this is a study about meaningful structures of professional choice, which is performed by means of quantitative network analysis, which means that this is really quantitative cultural sociology of education, which some people don't believe even exists. Because, you know, cultural sociology is normally associated with qualitative research, and mainstream of quantitative research is normally thought of as culturally insensitive. But thanks to unique talents of Timoti Malakarni, this is happening right now. So I'm going to tell you about basic ideas which stand behind this study and how we come up with them. And then Tim will tell you about our results in details. So this is, first of all, it's like a disclaimer. So this is a study about meaning making. So it does contribute to our knowledge of how people actually decide about education and profession, but in a very limited, in a narrow way, because actually those who deal with analysis of educational and professional choice, they know pretty well that this the very concept of choice is a very complicated issue, and it is this naive view of how people choose actually has been overcome in literature long ago. So we are talking about meaning making, about choices. It doesn't mean that people who make sense of their choice in such a way which we're going to describe, they actually did it. We don't know yet. It's going to be the next stage. But so the whole study raised out of two critical concerns. So the first critical concern is people. We believe that people making educational and occupational decisions, people rather choose the whole way of life than mere future salaries. And as we know, the mainstream in economics and sociology is to treat a salary as a measure, a main measure of success. But what we're going to do is not just criticize this view, but try to propose our own way to deal with that and to build more multidimensional picture. So our first guess, our first attempt was build three dimensions of choice, which is instrumental, aesthetic, and ethical, which means that we believe that people not only want to be prosperous, but also want to be beautiful and proud with their jobs. And first, so we experienced a lot with research design, but we were finally unable to sort out statements which would be purely instrumental or purely ethical or purely aesthetical. So because of that, we had to follow the data and to work with actual association of statements without putting them into some pre-given three-dimensional space. And the second critical concern, which stands behind this study, is that meaning is not a thing which is hidden in the box of mind. Meaning that, for example, when we have a questionnaire, and when a person answers a question in the questionnaire, this answer is not a meaning itself. It needs to be hermeneutically reconstructed. Being Durkheimian, sort of Durkheimian cultural sociologists, we draw on the approach which normally known as Saussurean or structuralist in a wider sense, which means that meaning is governed by actually other meanings, by meaningful context, by network of meaning, if you will, by structure of meanings. That means that when you deal with this as isolated answer, it's not a meaning itself. So unless you build the connections with other meanings, because the answer on a questionnaire might actually mean a bunch of different things and might be connected to a bunch of meaningful contexts. So what we propose instead is to focus not on those isolated meanings, but on networks of meanings, because when you have network of or cluster of meanings, they actually clear up each other, and we know better how to deal with them. So this is kind of basic hermeneutical move in our research, and then Tim is going to tell you actually what he actually did with data.
Thanks, Dmitry, for the uniquely flattering introduction. So, Dmitry talked about a little bit of this, but just to kind of reiterate a little bit, when we were thinking of the question that Professor Karnoy asked earlier today, and he said that most researchers assume that people have kind of a unipolar idea of success. We didn't necessarily think this was the case. We thought people who have similar educational achievement and potential trajectories, we didn't think they necessarily would choose the same thing. And we wanted to know what they would choose. And so that's what we went to look at. Ta-da! We looked for some background research on this. We thought economics actually was doing some really good research. We actually are going to not cite, because apparently I didn't put the slide in there, some of the same research that we saw earlier. And what we found was economists had moved along, looking at especially major choice, and they'd gotten better and better at it. They started out with essentially similar longitudinal data, what we have here. Then they moved to some of this, essentially what they call induced counterfactuals. Well, they were like, well, if this one paid differently, would you go for that? And then they got even better, and they're like, we should do experiments. And so they started to experimentally vary people's beliefs about how much something, or how much a field would pay. And then they saw, oh, look, they choose this way. But in the end, they eventually conclude, this doesn't really explain much of the variance. In the end, it appears to be heterogeneous taste that explains the vast majority of the selection. So that we want to say, okay, we're going to try to measure those tastes. But cultural sociologists, and especially sociologists who do surveys, aren't really necessarily better in this direction. We've had a lot of cultural debates. Actually, the discussion over why people choose STEM is one of the most developed in this way, but a lot of the more general things, we look at things and say, oh, are there cultural differences between these groups? They say that education is, they both say, 90% of people say education is important for success. They look very culturally similar. When we think of culture, we're thinking of these networks of meanings that Dmitry mentioned, and so we weren't sure if that was the case. So what are we going to do? As Dmitry said, kind of based on a kind of structural linguistic understanding of meaning in which concepts mutually define one another. So if you associate a couple of concepts together, well then, that takes on the meaning. So what we're trying to do is have a survey. A survey is a lot more parsimonious than an interview. We don't talk to these people for a long time. But at the same time, we're trying to get a sense of texture of what they mean by different concepts. And what we're doing to do that is looking at where they're placed in a network of meanings that we do have. So this slide is probably not so necessary in this presentation. Da-da-da-da. Look at this, trajectories in education and career. We're using that data. So we use mostly the fall 2013 survey. That's where this group came into the project. That's where I got to help design the module for research. And what we looked at is you have these 18 potential things, and I don't know, that would potentially be things you would want in an occupational trajectory. And so they answer whether this is important. They can mark all 18 if they want to, but I throw them out. But most people marked, I think, about 5. So let's get to some results. First, but before that, let's talk about the problem here. So what we're going to do is we're going to assign linkages between these two concepts based on co-occurrence of the concepts, but not strictly co-occurrence in the sense that they pop up together frequently. The things that pop up together most frequently are simply the things that get mentioned most frequently. So what we're looking for is things that essentially predict each other popping up. They pop up together more frequently than you would expect if you just knew the prevalence of it in the population. It's a tiny bit more complicated than that, probabilistically, because if you have different distributions of likelihood of answering positively. So basically, if people have different bars, some people are going to mark a lot of things just because, like, yeah, it sounds good, click, 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 click. Some people are going to mark very few. And this actually ends up giving you more pairs than you would expect if you just looked at the prevalence within the population of these concepts. So to deal with that, I specified a logistic regression again with a polynomial term that essentially matches the expected increase in the number of pairs we would see. And if the two concepts predict each other with these basic controls on how many things they checked, well then I have them as linked as in a network diagram. So first let's see just prevalence. What do people say they want? They want to be prosperous. Fair enough. In this survey, prosperity had an economic tinge to it. The next two things were stability and always in demand. So essentially we have our relative risk aversion that we talked about earlier there. And then the whole way down to, I think, a craft was the lowest. Emotional toughness of craft, service to country. You had these, if we were talking to Dmitry, he would term them ethical concerns. Maybe not a craft, but service to country. And also just to clarify again, Dmitry, aesthetic didn't necessarily mean beautiful as in, why, looking fine today, but essentially that you have a lifestyle that you imagine yourself doing. And it's not necessarily maximizing financial success, but rather, there you are, you imagine yourself doing this life, and you're going to try to match that with your choices. So, now let's look at some graphs. So here we are. Here's a network diagram of positive conceptual associations for the total population. One thing I don't think Dmitry or I have mentioned yet is when they were talking about generating this list of 18 concepts, they talked about these kind of 6 iconic professions, how people would describe them in these different dimensions. That was part of the generation. So there was a possibility that we were just going to get triads surrounding these professions. Essentially, we get out exactly what we put in there, and we have an aesthetic, ethical, and economic rationale for each of these. As you can see, there's actually a bizarrely small number of triads for a network diagram. Instead, what you see is these couple of clusters. Over here, we have a cluster, what we might consider ethical things. You have service to country, taking self-control and courage, emotional toughness. You can expect these. Honest and useful, dedicated selfishness, taking care of employees. You have these couple of different ethical things that are pretty regularly linked. Down here, we have what we call a technical cluster, technical, substantive things, which kind of means doing something actual, real, modern technologies. And over here we see prosperity, which, the dots are scaled by the frequency in the overall population. Prosperity was the most commonly chosen thing, but it's not the most neatly embedded in the diagram, which is really interesting in the sense it suggests that prosperity doesn't have an agreed upon meaning, or at least people who say they want to be prosperous don't have an agreed upon trajectory in the same way some of the other concepts do. Which is kind of fascinating, because we expect it to be a dominating factor here. Let's look at the negative conceptual associations. I didn't scale these. That's why the dots are bigger. Look at this. Now we have prosperity over here at the center of the only cluster there is. It's really well defined in terms of what if people say they want to be prosperous, or if they say they want to be honest and useful, they're not going to say prosperous. So if you're interpreting this, in some ways it's a lot more interesting to know what they're not going to do based on saying they want to be prosperous. Or if they're honest and useful, they're saying, okay, prosperity doesn't really matter to me. And this is a really interesting part of the meaning structure. So this is the general population. What you can also do with these is you can break it down into subgroups and provide kind of an interpretation of differences in meaning. Hello? So, back to it. So we talked a lot, still on? Talked a lot about the differences between academic and vocational high schools today, and here are what the meaning structure differences look like. As you can see, one thing I also forgot to mention, because I'm using significance levels to determine what I'm considering connected, this is actually very sensitive to sample size. So you get a bigger sample, it's going to look like a more well-defined network. However, all these comparisons that I give you, they're downsampled, so the two comparison groups are the same size. Here we are. Basically, we have the exact same thing that we see in the general population. There's 1 or 2 less connections. That could be because if we had to drop some sample size, so things that would have sneaked past significance don't anymore. I'm not sure if that's the case. But fundamentally, you see the meanings we see in the total society. Now let's jump to the vocational schools. All of a sudden, all these connections disappear. There's very few connections. So this doesn't suggest that people at vocational schools don't have meaningful ideas about what they want their future to be, but it does suggest that there isn't patterned meanings amongst the population of vocational schools that are similar to the way we have in the pattern of academic schools. So there's either greater heterogeneity. Maybe I was talking to this about somebody the other day. They suggested that you might have essentially a national culture in terms of people who are at academic institutions, or you might have more regional cultures, and that just cancels out things. But there's something going on here that suggests that people here just aren't enmeshed in a similar, we could call it a culture of thinking about the future in quite the same way. Which is kind of fascinating, because you'd expect if somebody's enmeshed in one of these cultures, and even if something shakes their belief in one of these meanings, there's a network tendency toward triadic closure if you think two things are positively related. And so if A is positively related to B and A is positively related to C, then you're likely to positively relate A and C. So essentially, it stabilizes meanings. And especially in those clusters like you saw in the first couple of things, if you're there, you have a lot of mutual reinforcement in what your future would like. Whereas here, you have very little. Now let's look at the gender difference. Okay. So here we are, and there's just one major thing I'm going to point out here. And that is stability. So stability here, this is the positive conceptual association for females. Again, we've jumped back to the entire population. That's female. We see stability is attached to economic prosperity. Stability was one of the, I think for females it's the second most commonly chosen adjective after prosperity. Now let's look at for males. Stability's jumped the whole way over here. No longer is it associated with prosperity at all, but rather it's associated with service to country. So we have this same concept that's actually very important. It was the third most commonly chosen thing for males, very close in the amount of people that chose it. But for one group, it's connected with prosperity. One, it's connected to service to country. If you remember, that negative conceptual association is itself negatively associated with prosperity and service to country are negatively associated themselves. So here you have essentially antithetical meanings. In surveys, we tend to take these things, questions, and assume that if people answer them in different groups, they mean the same thing. What's exciting to approach like this to me is we don't have to do that anymore. We can at least look at where they're nested within the larger set of meaning structures, and we can look, we should really make sure that we understand that stability can mean something really different for one group than another. Which I think is a big improvement over some of the past survey work, especially past survey work looking at cultural variables. So, that's most of what I have to say. What do you want to do in the future? Well, you might have noticed we're basically the only people here today that didn't use the longitudinal nature of this survey. And we'd like to change that. So we now have this set up, and we'd like to look at the way in which people's particular... So these are... The graphs I just showed you are group level things to be interpreted. They're not individual things, but you can place people in their individual space within those group level things. And the thing I'm most curious to look at is whether someone whose meanings fit within an existing nested cultural group is more stable in their overall inclinations than people who have actual meanings that in theory would be, if not contradictory, at least not mutually reinforced by the meanings that exist there. That's one of the things we want to look at. We want to look at there's actually more things in here where people are asked to describe professions. This is bounded. There are 18 terms they have to use. In these professional descriptions, they aren't bounded, though eventually they were binned. So it's interesting to use this method on a much bigger data and see how those compare. So those are a couple of things we want to do. We'd love to hear your comments. And if you want to give us ideas, even more stuff to do, that'd be great too. Thanks.
Thanks. Impressive and unique approach to the problem of meaning. But I have a methodological idea or concern. Since it was a paper-based survey, the survey items were not randomized, so the order was stable. And I'm wondering if the order of items affected co-occurrence of the items so that they picked the one that was, close to the one they already picked. And I'm wondering if there is a way to show that, that's not the case.
There is. In fact, so there isn't completely. You can never be entirely sure that's not the case. But co-occurrence doesn't seem to overly cluster within a single part of the survey. It also doesn't seem to, the frequency of being named doesn't tail down tremendously over the course of the survey. So that's about the best we can do. You can't, I guess, ever exactly say that people didn't name two that were more closely placed in the survey. I would also think it would be better if it was randomized. But I know, kind of for face validity, looking at the frequency chart, which I think is in order, there doesn't seem to be huge patterns. Oops. Yeah, well, never mind. We won't look at the frequency chart. But it doesn't scream that those are the issues. I kind of looked at, especially with thinking of things at the beginning of long survey lists, tend to become named longer. But they wasn't a huge predictor outside of prosperity. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Очень интересное исследование и очень перспективное. Но у меня просто вот такие вопросы на разъяснение. Скажите, пожалуйста, вы, так сказать, обнаруживали кластеры на основе лингвистической структуры, на основе смыслов лингвистических. А изучали ли вы, рассчитывали ли вы частоту, то есть частоту попадания всего вашего массива в различных кластерах, в различные кластеры? То есть укладывается ли весь массив, раскладывается ли он на какой-то набор кластеров? И есть ли как бы люди, которые проскакивают мимо кластеров? Ну, то есть частота попадания в различные кластеры. И насколько эти кластеры покрывают весь массив опрошенных?
I would say there are lots of people who don't fall into clusters. This maps the general social outline, but if everyone had to be put into a cluster, I suspect you would find, especially in, say, like the vocational school, you would have to find a lot more elaboration of the meaning structures. In some ways, more than thinking about it on individual cluster sorting, it's almost easier to think about it as mapping the amount of meaning coherence at the larger social level, and the more elaborated the structure is, that suggests that more people share meanings in a similar way. But it doesn't necessarily mean that any one individual has to be in one of these clusters. You could tell the computer to sort them into their best matches if you wanted to. We've resisted doing that because I think you would probably oversort in some ways unless you had a other cluster. But yeah, and the one difference between cluster analysis that I didn't mention is cluster analysis is usually an exclusive sorting mechanism. It doesn't really show, outside of things that are in clusters or not in clusters, which is an easy way to talk about this, it doesn't show the structural position of things. It doesn't show the linkages. If three things are linked in a row, cluster analysis might grab that as a cluster, but it doesn't show that there's two paired linkages and one pair of clusters that isn't linked. And so that's why we didn't do something like kind of standard cluster analysis on this data, though I suspect you'd end up with pretty similar results.
Я не социолог, поэтому прошу прощения, если я что-то не так понял. Значит, у меня два вопроса. Первый – это вопрос о возрасте тех ваших испытуемых, относительно которых эти схемы были сделаны. И второй, концептуальный. Предполагаете ли вы какие-то фокусировки ваших контекстов? То есть, когда центром является там одно или два слова, а другие находятся вокруг них и имеют, условно, метафорически выражаясь, меньший удельный вес. Подоплека этого вопроса связана, как раз с лонгитюдом, потому что, и из возрастной психологии, говоря об этом, можно предположить, что меняются именно эти фокусировки кластера.
So one of the Still working? It's my own ear. So one of my enduring regrets, to speak to the second question, is that we didn't do this in the 9th grade wave. This is all from the 11th grade wave, which is a time at which, as we've seen earlier, there's already been some selection into tracks. It would have been more interesting in my mind to look at the change between those two periods, but we can't, unfortunately. So we have to do, I guess, what we can with it. I think 11th grade is a good time, and I feel a little bit better about it after looking at some of the, or listening to some of the papers that we've heard today, simply because we talked about the path from vocational school back to higher education. So it seems like it's still possible at this time that we would expect certain groups with certain meanings, and it would be kind of interesting to see if students in the vocational track who actually had meaning patterns that are more closely aligned to the students who are in traditional academic tracks are the students who eventually move back into more formal higher education. So.
Я потому о возрасте начал говорить, потому что увидел у вас там в одном кластере, ну, такую фокусировку «быть важным для». Ну, что-то вот это вот типа. Это типически подростковая, ну, форма самоопределения, хотя она может оставаться на всю жизнь потом. Не все выходят из подросткового возраста.
We'll have to see.
So this is the work in progress. So what are your plans for the future analysis, and what kind of results do you expect? Because, well, if it is a sociological analysis, maybe you would like to draw some conclusions regarding particular social groups or individuals, or the borders, or how different social entities are delineated within the society. And yeah, it's very interesting. How do you plan to do it?
So one thing that we haven't really done here and shown here that would speak to the discussion earlier of whether or not class influences people's essentially preferences. And some people would say that this means that it's a structurally determined choice. I'm not sure if I would go that far myself necessarily and how I conceptualize it, but it will be actually really interesting to look at the way in which, say, parental occupation, socioeconomic position sorts people into particular types of meanings that they value. So that's one thing that I'd like to look at that. And then, yes, I'd like to see later whether these things continue, these meaning differences predict differential sorting into the professions that you would expect, because there's some clear suggestions here. If you are interested in, like, what, self-control and courage, service to country, and these things aren't mentioned that often, but they're always mentioned together, it seems like you have a coherent set of meanings that's going to push you towards things like, well, in this survey, the choices, people that like most were military careers, which you might imagine, and doctors. But we have to see if people hold the course. And my hypothesis, yes, what I expect, is that people, the more nested they are in a set of kind of socially agreed upon meanings, the more that they will hold the course. But I could be totally wrong about that in the sense that they might have just, if they claim every socially accepted meaning, if they're very common, maybe they're just picking it up from society and don't have that personal meaning structure that's going to drive them over the years. So it's an empirical question, and I'm really fascinated to find out pretty soon what the answer is.
Okay, again, I thought they were all very strong papers. I enjoyed hearing them. I haven't had a chance to read any of them, but I thought all three authors really put together some very interesting and informative analyses. I think it discusses sort of as a choice between whether they want to make a lot of very tiny, small, maybe insignificant comments about each of the papers independently, or whether they want to try to sort of paint the big picture for you. I'm going to do the first, okay, because I really haven't had a chance to sort of look for all the connections between the three papers. Although I do think, one thing I think that does unite them is I found myself in each case wanting to know more about the context in which the results were in which people sort of enacted their behaviors. And I'll say that a little bit about that for each paper, but I just want to know more about sort of what's the social setting, what kind of mechanisms are in place that are bringing the results about. And in a sense, that's kind of raising the bar too high, and I understand that, but I think it's something to think about anyway. let me turn to the paper by Igor and Tatiana first for a few minutes. And you got to understand how strange it is for me to come all the way to Russia to hear people talk about a paper that was written by a colleague of mine, or written, influenced by a colleague of mine who's literally 40 feet away from me in my building back home. I mean, Ernie Pascarell works 40 feet down the hall from where I work, so it was kind of interesting to hear that. What these folks do, again, they set out sort of a puzzle. Why is it that students who do really well at time A are pretty likely not to do well at time B? What is it that happens between these 2 points in time that, kind of get in people's way? Okay, why do they, not perform at the same level over time? One of the first things that occurred to me is that maybe, and maybe this is wrong, but maybe in some sense it's kind of structural. I was thinking of research by Jim Rosenbaum several years ago who looked at high school tracking systems. And what he found is that most mobility between high school tracks is downward. Once people get in a track, they're much more likely to go down and, very unlikely to go up. And there's reasons for that. I mean, you have to achieve a certain level of things to keep climbing up tracks, and people just don't do it. So any movement through the course of high school tends to go downward. So in a sense, maybe part of what you're getting may be a ceiling effect, that people are already sort of maxed out at time one. They're doing as well as they can do, and it's just not possible for them to, kind of maintain, or it's, if not maintain, it's not possible for them to improve that position. Okay, so it could be that some of this that you're seeing is just sort of a structural characteristic of these systems you're in. I mean, it's sort of a weird twist on a cumulative advantage-disadvantage story, maybe in part. But anyway, they do find, as they point out, a very small, modest correlation between late high school performance and early university performance. They talk a lot about sort of this idea of these big five predictors, the economic or the psychology literature. Of course, that's five what they see as sort of key personality characteristics. And I think they correctly talk about conscientiousness as the most important of those five. It goes by different names. Sometimes you hear it called perseverance or stick-to-itiveness or grit or whatever. But I think they're right, is that conscientiousness seems to be sort of what underlies a lot of this stuff. I guess what strikes me there is, and I learned this from talking to psychologists more than reading psychology, I guess, but that some of those characteristics, those big five, are more malleable at some points in the life cycle than they are at other points. And my understanding, and I could be wrong about this, but that by the time people get to college, conscientiousness is maybe not as malleable as it was when they were at a younger age. So just sort of, kind of think about where in the life cycle or where in the life course you're talking about, and where that variable might come in. And I guess part of that too is, I guess I would wonder just how effective an intervention at that point addressed toward conscientiousness might be. And maybe the answer is that it could be very much so, but I think it's just something to look at. Let's see, what else do I want to say here? Oh, on a contextual thing too, it struck me too that maybe what you're getting is partly, it's not so much characteristics of the individual. Most of your measures are measures of the individual, and I think that's fine. But there may be things about that person's high school experience that are important in sort of this mismatch between time one and time two performance. You've got one of those. You talked about, I think, if it's an elite high school or something like that. But it strikes me you might have frog pond effects going on too. That people who are, one thing we find, research I've seen in the United States is people who are high school valedictorians, who are at the top of their class in bad high schools, tend not to do well when they go to college because they've come to think of themselves as much more talented than they perhaps are. So it may be that if you had some more measures, or at least thought a little bit more about, what are some characteristics of the high school environments in which these kids found themselves, might help to account for some of that mismatch that you find later. Let's see, what else? I guess the final thing I'd say, because time is tight here, is I was a little, I don't mean this in a strong way, but a little disappointed at the end when you sort of pulled back from his question by saying you weren't really trying to look at causal analyses. I think you ought to be, because I think you've got a causal story here, and I think most people anymore think about causation wrong. I think causation is not a methods issue. Okay, it's not a data issue. It's a theoretical issue. Okay, and it seems to me if you build a theoretical argument for why you've got a causal argument in place, that trumps method, that trumps data. You can build a causal historical argument without a sort of, random effects design or something, okay? So it seems to me if you've got a causal story to tell, you should be willing to tell it and just push the data as far as you can in that direction, okay? But having said all that, I think it's a really nice paper. I really like it a lot. Julia's question. We're here. Okay, right. Sorry. Again, I think it's a very, very important question. I think we need to know a lot more about, at what point this STEM pipeline gets clogged up. Why, very talented women and girls primarily in your case, why they sort of don't move down that pipeline with the regularity that their levels of ability would suggest they should be moving down that. I guess in a sense I'd ask kind of the same question that I asked, Igor, about the context here is, at what point in a kid's life does that math self-concept sort of solidify? And my guess is it's probably younger than the students in your sample. Okay, I don't know this for sure, but I would think that by the time kids are 4 or 5 years old, a lot of that kind of math self-concept has already been put in place. And certainly the sort of the anecdotal stuff you hear from other parents and things like that would suggest that little girls learn early, pretty early on that math is different for them maybe than it is for boys. Maybe think about that a bit. Again, you talk a lot about sort of how intrinsic motivation sort of trumps instrumental motivation, how it's more important in some ways. But again, what I'd ask there is, what's the source of that motivation? And what sort of social processes and mechanisms and family dynamics and peer dynamics? Where in there does this happen? Okay, where do these motivations sort of get produced? Okay. Let's see what else. Again, I'm not sure if I got much more to say about that, other than sort of, again, this may be a case, too, where you're getting frog pond effects. It seems to me that, some of the girls that have developed strong self-concepts in math may have just been in different high school situations in which that was, sort of allowed to flourish. Okay, so again, if you can say something about kind of the contextual setting in which these people found themselves, it might kind of, I think, flesh out the story a bit more. So I guess part of what I'm saying there is that, I think, to discuss sort of, university level social psychology, it helps to have kind of an understanding of preschool social psychology too. To really see it as a life course sort of thing to the extent that you can. And I guess the final thing I would say is I really appreciate your comments toward the end about measurement problems. I mean, I know you're sort of given what you got, but I thought you were sort of very refreshing the way you talked about measurement and owned up to those sorts of things. It's a nice paper, very nice paper. Tim and Dmitry, I think this is also a really strong piece of work. I like this a lot. What I particularly like, was what Dmitry introduced straight away, is that this is just sort of a demonstration or a strong case of why research questions have to determine what methods you use rather than the other way around. I think far too often people decide they want to do a qualitative study and they want to do a statistical study and sort of retrofit the questions to match that. I think it's absolutely the wrong way to do it. So I think the fact that you folks, chose your research questions, what you wanted to know, and then chose methods to fit those, I think is really the right way to go about things. Okay, I appreciate that a lot. I also like I'm not sure Tim, what term you used here, but it was sort of a realist conceptualization of people's behavior. I like that you kind of pulled away from, sort of a homo economicus argument. People just behave rationally and they do things these ways for these reasons, or sort of a sociological rational choice or rational action argument that you kind of pulled back from that. And so what I liked is you sort of, treat behavior as you actually, or study behavior as you actually encounter it. Okay, I thought that was a good thing. Having said that, and I think those are all good things, I think, sociologists really struggle with what we mean by meaning. All right, and that's sort of there's probably some there's some slippage here between sort of the way you think about meaning and the way you end up measuring it. And I think that's inevitable. Not much you can do about that. But there is some, it's a tough fit. I mean, it seems to me it's a tough fit. What the notes I used here, and I think I heard the same comment over there, is there's some kind of heroic measurement going on here. Okay, you really have to sort of put a lot of faith in some ways in your ability to do what you're doing. Although I found the results fascinating. People want prosperity, they want security. It's almost it's not really factor analysis, but it's sort of factor analysis that brings those things out. Again, and I think when you broke it down by subgroups, that was really interesting. But what I'd want to find myself asking then too is, what are the processes that take place within those settings that cause this stuff to happen? Why is being in a vocational classroom, a vocational school, why does that lead to? What are the mechanisms that make that lead to different outcomes in an academic school? What kind of things happen in a vocational setting that might? Pardon me?
I'm not sure they do. I'm not sure it's not sorting into the different.
Oh, it could be. Yeah, it could be entirely sorting. So, but, yeah. So that's interesting. I mean, it seems to me to sort of tell a deeper story there. I guess the So again, that on mechanisms, the final comment I would make is just I really look forward to seeing what you do with this longitudinally. I think that'd be really sort of an interesting thing to pursue. So, thank you.